Alright, so we're continuing through the book of Job. I'll turn on my tie mic here and see if that makes it too loud. Still good? Alright. So we're continuing through the book of Job, and last week Elihu started talking. Elihu isn't one of Job's three main friends. He seems to be a young bystander. He's been kind of listening to their conversation, and once they've all said everything they want to say, Elihu speaks up. And as I said last week, it's kind of hard to tell where to classify Elihu. You know, Job, at the end of the book, God's going to say to Job that, he said what was right. And he's going to say to Job's three friends that they're in big trouble for the kinds of things they've said. God doesn't even mention Elihu. So it's kind of left up to us to determine whether his speeches are good or not. And it seems like he falls into some of the same errors as the three friends, but he also makes some useful and true contributions to the conversation. His biggest contribution is in trying to take the focus of the discussion. Should I turn off the tie mic? Trying to take the focus of the discussion off of Job and put it back on God. And we see that right in his introduction, if we go back to where we were last week for a minute, in chapter 32, verses 1 through 3, when we're introduced to Elihu. It says, So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God, and he burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. So his anger at Job isn't necessarily justified, and his approach to this whole thing may come across a bit arrogant at times, but Elihu does have a point. And throughout the rest of chapter 32, he goes on to give reasons why he must speak. And then tonight we're going to start in on his answers to Job's questions. Because Job has been asking a lot of questions throughout the book so far. So chapter 33, we start verses 1 through 7. This is kind of Elihu's opening statement to Job. And if you remember, up to this point, Job keeps saying that he wants to argue his case before God. He wants to explain to God why God shouldn't be angry at him and should just stop doing all these horrible things to him. But he's afraid that if he did get this audience with God, that he would be so overwhelmed by the power and the awe of God that he wouldn't be able to speak. So Elihu answers up. Verses 1 through 7 says, But now hear my speech, O Job, and listen to all my words. Behold, I open my mouth, the tongue in my mouth speaks. My words declare the uprightness of my heart, and what my lips know, they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me if you can. Set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Behold, I am toward God as you are. I too was pinched off from a piece of clay. Behold, no fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy upon you. Elihu basically offers to have the conversation with Job that Job has been saying he wants to have with God. He says, after all, they're both human beings, made of dirt and brought alive by the breath of God. They're equals. Job, you don't have to be scared of me like you would be of God if he showed up, so why don't you and I talk about all these things that you want to talk about? And again, as we said last week, it's admirable that Elihu seems to genuinely want to answer Job's questions rather than just tell Job what a horrible person he is for daring to ask the questions, because that's pretty much all that his other three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, have been doing. So it's admirable that Elihu wants to actually talk. But Elihu also needs to be careful about setting himself up as the spokesman of God who has all the answers. And the fact that he's doing that becomes really obvious later on if you skip back in just a couple chapters to chapter 36, verses 2 through 4. This is still Elihu speaking. He says, Bear with me a little, and I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf. I will get my knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker. For truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. Wow. A little bit arrogant. Because does Elihu know everything that's going on in Job's situation? No. Because the events that really kicked off this whole thing, kicked off all of Job's suffering, took place in heaven between God and Satan in this conversation that they had. And Elihu is completely ignorant of that. He doesn't know exactly what's going on. He doesn't know why this is happening. And we need to learn from his example to be very careful about claiming to know the definitive reason why something happened. And I'm always trying to find the reason that God allowed this to happen in my life. There's a difference between being able to see some of the benefits that come out of a bad situation and being able to say, oh yeah, I understand exactly why it happened. It's not the same thing. We know a lot of times. We can see the good things that come out of a situation. But we don't know all of the reasons why it happened. An example would be someone who loses a child. Their child dies, and someone gets saved at the funeral. It's great that we can recognize that someone came to know Jesus Christ as their Savior as a result of this child's death. But to tell that parent, yeah, that's why your child died, so so-and-so could get saved. That's pretty uncaring. And it's probably not everything that's going on in this situation. Deuteronomy 29:29 is a great verse. It's towards the end of Deuteronomy as Moses is wrapping up giving the law. We've looked at the same verse before as we've been going through Job. And it says this. It says, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. Just as, like the children of Israel, our responsibility is to focus on living according to what God has revealed to us in His Word. It is not our job to speculate on things that God has kept to Himself. It says, the things that I keep to myself, those are mine. The secret things, those belong to me. You don't need to worry about them. You need to worry about what I've revealed to you. You don't need to look for the reason why in everything that happens. As we said this morning when we went through the book of Habakkuk, and Habakkuk is looking around and he's seeing all the awful things that are happening in the world, and he keeps asking, why? And the question really comes down to who God is. It says, you don't need to know all the reasons why, you just need to trust me. Because I'm in control, I'm accomplishing my will, whether you understand it or not. So Elihu is being a bit of a know-it-all here. But like I said, he does make some decent contributions, so we'll keep looking at what he has to say. Verses 8 through 12, Elihu is going to list Job's arguments that he intends to address himself. Like I said, he's been standing here listening the whole time to what Job and his friends have been saying. So he kind of restates some of Job's arguments that Job has made up to this point. He says, surely you have spoken in my ear, and I have heard the sound of your words. You say, I am pure without transgression, I am clean, and there is no iniquity in me. So he says, first of all, he's going to address Job's claim to be sinless. Now, did Job ever claim to be perfectly sinless? No, Job didn't. Elihu is kind of misunderstanding what Job has been saying up to this point. Job has claimed to be free from unrepentant sin and in a right relationship with God. He never said that he hasn't sinned. Elihu is making the same mistake that Job's friends have. After all, Job is described as a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Who described him that way? Yeah, God. Twice in the opening chapters, in 1:8 and 2:3. So Elihu is off the mark here. He hasn't been understanding what Job is going to say, and that's going to turn out a little later when he addresses that question. But he continues, in verse 9. Verse 10. He says, behold, he finds occasion against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths. Now Job did say that. He says, behold, in this you are not right. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Job did make those claims. Elihu is pretty much quoting Job word for word when he says that. And Job, throughout the book, has seemed to assume that the only possible reason that God would allow these horrible things to happen to him is that God is somehow angry at him. Even though, he knows he's done nothing wrong. He knows God's not angry at him for sinning, but he still feels that God is hostile towards him. God is his enemy. God is maybe even angry at him. And that's the only reason he can think of why these sufferings would be happening. And Elihu is right to object to this way of thinking. This suffering that Job is going through doesn't have anything to do with the wrath of God. Does it have anything to do with God's hostility against Job? Not at all. It's come about because God is demonstrating to Satan, of all people, that there is such a thing as a righteous person on earth. And that's Job, that no matter what Satan does to him, Job is going to remain a righteous man. So this whole idea that Job has, that this is all God's hostility against him, Elihu's right. Job isn't looking at it the right way. Well, Elihu continues in verse 13 and 14. It says, why do you contend against him, saying, he will answer none of man's words? For God speaks in one way, and in two, though man does not perceive it. This is what Elihu is going to talk about for the rest of the chapter. Job's claim that God has refused to answer him. Sometimes, he says, God speaks or works in ways that people don't realize because it's not what they were expecting. Job has repeatedly accused God of not answering him, of not doing anything on his behalf. And Elihu says, Job, I don't think you're right. It's kind of like Christians who say, well, God didn't answer my prayer. What they mean is God didn't answer my prayer the way I wanted him to answer my prayer. If you're a child of God and your life is free from unrepentant sin, God did answer your prayer when you prayed. He just didn't necessarily answer it exactly as you wanted. Maybe the answer was no, I have something better for you. Maybe the answer was not, wait, be patient. But that's what Elihu's going to address. God sometimes speaks in ways that might not be recognized as him speaking, or works in ways that might not be recognized as him working. And he starts out in verses 15 through 18 that God sometimes speaks through dreams. So in verse 15 it says, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men while they slumber on their beds, then he opens the ear of men and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn man aside from his deeds and conceal pride from a man. He keeps back his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. Now Elihu's right, that in Old Testament times, God did speak to people through dreams. Now Elihu has kind of a narrow view of it. He seems to think that God speaks to people in dreams primarily to warn them away from sin. As we'll discover, this is going to be one of Elihu's favorite topics, is warning away from sin. But God spoke through dreams. Now, this method does not seem to be God's normal way of speaking to us today. Not saying that he can't do it. He's God, he can do what he wants. But it does not seem to be his normal way of speaking to us. And the reason I say that, there's several passages. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This, of course, is the love chapter. First Corinthians 13, towards the end of it, verses 8 and 9, as Paul is describing the supremacy of love over all other gifts, he says, love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. It says, by its very nature, prophecy is temporary and incomplete. That would include prophetic dreams, any form of prophecy. It says, when the perfect revelation comes, prophecy will no longer be needed. By its very nature, it's temporary. And then go over to Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and the first part of verse 2 says, long ago, and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. And then he goes on to describe the supremacy of Jesus over all other beings and all other revelation of God. So in past ages, including Job's day, God used a variety of prophetic gifts, including dreams, as Elihu points out. But now, his perfect revelation is Jesus Christ. That is the way that he has revealed himself to us in all his fullness. And what Jesus said and did, of course, are recorded in the Gospels. And the significance of that and what it means to us is throughout the New Testament. So that is God's main way of speaking to us today. He doesn't generally speak through dreams. That was a past, partial sort of thing. But in Job's day, it was still a perfectly valid way of God speaking to people. Elihu goes on. Another way, he says, that God speaks to people. Starting in verse 19. It says, man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with continual strife in his bones, so that his life loathes bread and his appetite the choice of foods. His flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen, and his bones that were not seen stick out. His soul draws near the pit, and his life to those who bring death. Elihu says that God speaks through suffering. This is an important new thought in this discussion. That suffering is not always just punishment. That sometimes it is God speaking. The question that Job has been asking of why is God angry with me isn't usually the right question to ask when we suffer. Now, we are told that for God's children, suffering is sometimes a demonstration of God's displeasure if we are living in unrepentant sin. You have an example of that over in 1 Corinthians 11 when the Corinthian church was treating the Lord's Supper lightly, so God made a number of them sick and even killed some of them. But in general, for God's children, suffering is only a demonstration of God's displeasure when we're living in unrepentant sin. Otherwise, it's something else. Job's three friends have assumed that the only possible reason for suffering is punishment. And Elihu says, well, it could also be a way that God is speaking to you. Now, Elihu doesn't go too much beyond what the friends do, because Elihu says the primary purpose of God speaking through suffering is a warning to change your ways. Either because you've already sinned or you're in danger of doing so on the course you're on, so God is, turning you back into the right path. And sometimes this is the case. The discipline of God for an erring child is described over in Hebrews chapter 12. When we get off path, sometimes God brings suffering into our life to get us back to Him. Sometimes, even when we're not off path, God can bring suffering in our life to keep us humble. Think of Paul. The Apostle Paul, over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the start of the chapter, he talks about how he has had visions in which he was caught up to heaven. He saw incredible things that he wasn't even allowed to describe. And he says a man, but he's talking about himself. But then in verse 7, it says to... Oops. I hope I were in 2 Corinthians. It says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. Paul hadn't fallen into sin yet, but God knew that there was a danger that since he had received such amazing revelation, it would be pretty easy for Paul to start thinking what a great guy he was. So God allows Satan to in some way physically hurt Paul. What exactly it was, we don't know. Something that was bad enough that Paul kept praying to God to remove it, and in the end God told him, no. I'm not going to remove this, because it's going to teach you to depend on me. It's going to teach you that when you're weak, when you're dependent on me, that is when you're strong. That would be the kind of thing that Elihu is talking about. God uses suffering sometimes to keep us on a path that is right, rather than straying into sin. One of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, in The Problem of Pain, says this. It says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. A lot of times it's God's way of getting our attention, of reminding us that we have to rely on him. But this view of God speaking through our pain just to keep us on track is still too narrow. Elihu isn't thinking big enough. He still has suffering always related to sin in some way or another. He says, it might not be direct punishment, but it's still related to keeping you away from sin. But sometimes suffering has other uses. Sometimes God allows suffering to happen to shape our character. Not away from sin, but towards who he wants us to be. If you go to James chapter 1. James chapter 1, if we pick up in verse 2, James writing to Christians says, Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, or patience, or endurance. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. James says, when trials come, you can still be joyful, because you know that God is going to use that to produce in you character traits that are pleasing to him. And he focuses on the idea of steadfastness, of endurance, of patience. Other times, the reason for suffering could be something even bigger. In Job's case, it's something on a cosmic scale. It's God using Job's suffering to prove to the spirit world that Satan is a liar and that there are truly godly people in the world. And there's absolutely no way Job could possibly know that. The only reason we know that is because we're told in the first couple chapters of the book. And again, it comes back to, we don't always know the reason for suffering. It's really a lot of times pointless to try and figure out the reason for suffering. As long as it's not because of unrepentant sin in your life, the reason why you might not get the answer to. And that's okay. As Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong to God. What He's revealed is for us and our children. God has revealed to us that He works all things together for good. The good things, the bad things, the happiness, the suffering. He's revealed that to us. We can hold on to that. We can trust in that. We don't need to go digging into the secret things of God and trying to figure out why it happened. Elihu keeps going. And this is where it gets really interesting. Remember in the past, Job, he had this insight where he talked about the resurrection. And it was really incredible because nothing in that regard had been revealed yet. Elihu has something very similar here. He basically says to Job that, for all you know, something might be happening in heaven. He's right in that. He gets wrong exactly what it is that's happening in heaven, as we'll see in a minute. But he says to Job, Job, maybe this is what's going on. And there's no way for that you would possibly know that. The fact that we cannot see God at work does not mean that God is sitting idle and doing nothing. Well, here's what Elihu says might be going on in heaven. Starting in verse 23. It says, if there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000, to declare to man what is right for him, and he is merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth, and let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then men pray to God, and He accepts him, and He sees His face with a shout of joy, and He restores to man his righteousness. He sings before men and says, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down into the pit, and my life shall look upon the light. Elihu says, Job, for all you know, you have someone in heaven speaking on your behalf. Because Job has over and over again said, how I wish there was someone in heaven who would speak on my behalf before God. And Elihu says, Job, how do you know that's not what's going on? And what he describes is very interesting. He suggests that maybe there's a special angel who could be making intercession for him, verse 23, who maybe would agree to pay his ransom, verse 24, who may restore his body, verse 25, who would restore his righteousness, verse 26, who would remove the deserved penalty of his sins, verse 27, and who would redeem him, verse 28. Does that sound like anyone we know? Yeah, there is a very special angel in the Old Testament. He's called the angel of the Lord. And he shows up from time to time. And who is the angel of the Lord? He's the Lord Himself. It's God appearing in a visible form. Most likely it's God the Son, Jesus, before the incarnation. And He does for us exactly what Elihu describes here. He paid our ransom. He makes us righteous before God. He removes the penalty that we deserve for our sins. And He promises a future resurrection. And He makes intercession for us. Now that's not exactly what's going on in Job's case. Job was already in a right standing before God. But I think it's pretty amazing. Elihu would come up with this. So you don't know what's going on in heaven. Maybe it's this. For the time being, he was wrong. But right now, that is what's going on. That is what Jesus has done for us. We do have a mediator in heaven who stands before God and pleads on our behalf when we sin and offers us forgiveness. Unfortunately, then, Elihu goes back to the old theme that Job needs to repent. In verse 27, basically says the proper response is to admit that he sinned. So he's kind of fallen back into where Job's friends are, unfortunately. Elihu isn't perfect. But Elihu summarizes in verses 29 and 30. It says, behold, God does all these things twice, 3 times with a man, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be lighted with the light of life. Basically saying, God isn't necessarily punishing you, He's guiding you away from death and destruction. And Elihu's point that God is at work, whether you feel like it or not, is a good point. Now, his application of that truth to Job is not quite right, because he really doesn't know what's going on in Job's life. He pretty much assumes that he understands the secret ways of God better than all the others that are standing there, which is unfortunate. But he wraps up in verses 31 through 33 for this part of his speech. It says, "Pay attention, O Job, listen to me, be silent, and I will speak. If you have any words, answer me, speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me, be silent, and I will teach you wisdom." He basically gives Job the option of either answering what he's just said and claiming to be on Job's side, "Job, I want to justify you," or allowing him to keep speaking and teaching wisdom. And apparently Job lets him keep speaking, because next week we'll pick up in chapter 34 as Elihu keeps going without Job replying. But even though Elihu was a bit off on some things here, he has some very interesting contributions to this that were true and good. That God is at work, whether we feel like it or not. You can't ever look around in your life and say, "God didn't do this," or I don't see God. Maybe you can't see him, but he's there. He's at work, whether we understand it or not. He's right, that suffering does not necessarily mean that God is angry at you. In fact, unless you are living in unrepentant sin, God isn't angry at you. Jesus Christ took the penalty for our sin. And even if you're living in unrepentant sin, it's just a necessity of restoring that fellowship, not of being saved again. Suffering has many other reasons. It has a whole variety of purposes. It can be discipline. That's, Job's 3 friends, that's the only reason they see for suffering. It could be a safeguard. That's, Elihu's preferred reason. God's safeguarding you and trying to get you back on the right path because you just might be straying. Or you might be about to face temptation to stray. It might be shaping our character, teaching us patience, endurance, driving us back to depending on God rather than on our own strength and our own abilities. And sometimes, the reason is known only to God. God doesn't tell us to try and figure out why bad things happen. In fact, he tells us that the things he hasn't revealed belong to him. They're not really our business. What he asks us to do is to trust him and to follow what he has revealed, not to obsess over things that are beyond our understanding, not to think that he's angry at us, not to think that he's not at work, but to trust that he will do exactly what he said, that he will work all things together for our good, that whatever he's doing, he's good and he is loving. So he has a good and loving reason for doing it. Just trust that, rather than getting ourselves all worked up. Next week, Elihu's going to address some of Job's other things. And again, I give him about a C- in how he does at answering them. But he does make some more useful contributions to the discussion. That's for next week. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Father, I thank you for the example that we have in this book of Job once again. Thank you that we can trust you. Help us to do so, even when we don't understand what's going on, even when to us it doesn't look like you're doing anything. It seems like you're silent and not answering. Help us to remember who you are. Help us remember what you promised us. And help us to trust in you. Have the faith to live the life of peace and contentment that you want us to live. Not to obsess, not to try and figure out things that don't belong to us but belong to you alone. In Jesus' name, amen.